Thank you, good evening, and welcome to our panel on the developing world in front of multi-crises. My name is Cheryl Novak. I'm a research associate from ELIAMEP, and I have the pleasure of guiding this discussion today. Our panel today is approximately 40 minutes, and it will be divided into two key themes. The first is going to be familiarizing ourselves with some of the main issues of our speakers today from the countries and the regions within which they work. And then the second half, we're going to focus a bit more on multilateral collaborations and working with this overarching theme of paradigm shift, probably and hopefully finding some ways, a positive note to end this panel on so we can talk about the way forward to try to overcome some of these crises. So without further ado, I'd like to enable each speaker to again present themselves, the context within which they're working. And then after our initial introductions, each speaker will have a few minutes to discuss some of the key crises that their country or region are going through. So please, I'd like to introduce Daban Najmadden.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, everyone, and for staying this late. And I would like to warmly thank Delphi teams, Simon and the other colleagues in Delphi for inviting us to this panel. My name is Daban Najmadden. I'm the CEO of Superpower Incorporation. We are working in energy sector, and we run a power plant, and we also work in renewable energies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bogolo, Kenewendo, please.
Thank you, Cheryl, and good evening, everyone. And like you said, it's quite late in the day, so good to see a few people in the room still. My name is Bogolo Kenewendo, and I'm from Botswana. I'm a special advisor to the UN High-Level Climate Champion, COP27 and COP28. And we work on catalyzing non-state actors into around climate action and our long-term climate goals. I have a special focus in Africa, development and the transition, mainly because this last year we were focusing on exactly how it is that we profile and highlight what climate action really means with a development imperative for Africa and hopefully being scalable for the rest of the global south. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yasmine, Shihata, please, a few words.
Yes, thank you. I'm an Egyptian entrepreneur in the media and PR industry. I started quite young. I was raised abroad, so part of the vision of everything I do is bringing the East and West closer together, a better understanding of our image of Arab men and women, especially the new modern generation, in the region and around the world. We also do events around the world because, as somebody raised abroad, we still feel that there's a big misperception about our region, women in our region, and how our region is changing. So through our media platforms and the events that we do, that's something we're very passionate about and that we continue to tackle and focus on now.
Thank you, Yasmine. And Mario Pezzini, please, a few words, and then after we complete our introduction, we'll go back down the line and you can all introduce some of the key issues of your region. And Mario, of course, you're here under one title, but we will be drawing on your OECD experience, so that's a...
Yes. Happy that we continue, because I have to say I disagree on the idea of the paradigm shift. But stated that, yes, I was in OECD many years, in charge in particular of the OECD Development Center, where we had 55 members, not Botswana, but Egypt, it was member and so on. And now I am editor of a review of India, which is called Development Cooperation Review, and I am special advisor in UNESCO.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, Daban, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. We had a brief conversation before the panel, and you informed me of some of the key issues and concerns that you're facing right now within Iraq. And I would like if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks. Thank you, Cheryl. Actually, the main issue that we have in Iraq is political instability, which has rooted in every aspect of the country, and this has become the backbone of the problems for serious sectors like energy sector. And the political instability in Iraq is because of the diversion of the country into three main parts, which is the Shi'i part, the Sunni part, and the Kurdish part. For someone who doesn't have any knowledge about the Iraqi situation, I think the 10 minutes or 15 minutes is not enough to explain everything, but we will wrap it up for the challenge and the crisis. The former government, we had protests, we had demonstrations, and it ended with changing the government because the country was covered with corruptive missions, and we had the last election, which lasted for almost a year just to form the government. It created a lot of issues. For example, we didn't have the budget for the country to spend for the projects. We had to delay all the process, but fortunately, with the current government, which is it's been 6 months, they have made big changes and big reforms, especially the institutionalization of the government. It has been very effective in changing the shape of the economic situation for the country. Let me tell you one example. In the Iraqi government, we have a military. It's called and it has separate parts. In this part, the 25,000 names were given to the government that these people are employed, but in the real number it was 10. So 25,000 people were receiving salary, but 10,000 people were in service. We had extra 15,000 salaries going because they were paid by cash. Within this new system, now they are paid through bank accounts, and it's not possible to have an account which you are not existing. This was one of the serious challenges that the government went through, and the current prime minister empowered the Iraqi central bank to make decisions. Yes, we had the price of Iraqi dinar depreciated for an amount of time. It was a huge political risk that he took because the Iraqi dinar lost its value against the US dollar, but because of the central bank and the efforts they put, now the Iraqi dinar is much stronger than before, and it was all because of the central bank and the decisions made by the prime minister. It also has pushed him to make reforms in the energy sector to use the energy revenue in a more transparent way for covering the projects for the country. I don't want to take much more time.
Okay, yeah, so thank you. I think that as we go down the line, we're going to see a lot of the same themes, and hopefully we'll be able to draw the threads together, and that's going to help us in the second half of the panel, so thank you. Bogolo, can you please tell us a little bit more about perhaps Botswana, or if you feel comfortable speaking also to the experience in Africa, which you can draw on your experience from some of your other roles, feel free.
Thanks. So it's been a really interesting year for the continent in general. And I say the year, even though it's been three years really of a tumultuous period. And many times when we talk about a polycrisis, we're referencing COVID/pandemic, talking about the impact of the Ukraine war, and then we're talking about the current fiscal instabilities, inflation, and so forth. And we, earlier on at the Munich Security Conference, I questioned why it is that within this concoction of a polycrisis, we do not mention the various instabilities that are happening around the world. And if we highlight those that are happening in the continent in particular, the insurgencies that are happening in Cameroon, and of course at this particular moment, that's what's happening in Sudan, and what was happening in Ethiopia and many others. And these are all considerations we have to take into account when we're thinking about first geopolitical stability, and we're thinking about a joint and mutual global economic recovery. We have to think about how the rest of the world is operating and functioning. And the bulk of the focus post-COVID was on, no one is safe if we're not safe. And I recall last year, the bulk of meetings of partnership and cooperation, EU, Africa, EU, US, is how do we handle pandemics better and how do we respond to them better? This is a question that we must deal with because when the time came, multilateralism failed the continent and people, many countries started being inward looking, and this has impacted to some extent how relations are in a multilateral space and the effectiveness of multilateralism. And as a result, there has been quite strong developments within the continent around regional economic communities, and more development in the last 2 years around the African Free Trade Continental Agreement and many other AU and continental Pan-African developments that are working to galvanize the unity of the continent in development. And I think that these, or really the way that the world has evolved in the last 3 years and its relationship with the continent will be quite determining for how exactly geopolitical shifts look like in the future and the effectiveness and relevance of multilateralism. And, it also hinges on exactly how it is that we're going to deal with the ensuing economic crisis without being alarmist in 2023 and beyond. How we respond now, with the World Bank meetings just coming to an end, and later in the year, how do we respond now to the financial needs of the V20? How do we respond to financing needs for sustainable development? And how do we all really move towards this common long-term goal around climate action? So it's a lot more questions, I think, that have been raised in the last 3 years. On multilateralism, unity, partnership towards economic development, sustainable development, and similarly towards peace and security, because we do need to realize the interdependentness of all of these issues. And I don't know how much deeper I could go. I could go much deeper into the subject matter, but I think just this high level is where I'll leave it for now.
Okay,
thank you.
Yes, I'm acutely aware that when we're talking about the developing world, this is a large geographical area, and 40 minutes is not enough. I think we need another Delphi forum to open the Pandora's box and to have some time to put things back into it. So I'd like now to move to Yasmine. Yasmine, I'm sure you've heard some common threads, speaking a little bit more before the session, the role of a female entrepreneur in Egypt. I'm sure that some of the crises that have been mentioned by some of the other speakers, they must resonate with you.
Yes, definitely. I mean, Egypt, the way us Egyptians now look at doing business in Egypt, it's pre-revolution and post-revolution. Before the Egyptian revolution, we used to be impacted by being in an unstable region or politically turbulent region. So, for example, when the Iraq War happened, Egypt got shook, our economy got shook. When there was a world recession, we got shook. But now it's post-revolution. Most of the instability we have is from our own internal problems and issues. And doing business in Egypt now has become very, very challenging, and you're constantly looking out for what could come next. I mean, as some of you might know, we had military curfews after the revolution, where we used to have to go to the office and be back by 3 p.m. A lot of businesses shut down. We continued to do that. Then after President Sisi took over, we also had another phase of a military curfew where the economy slowed down. That was actually for us much more difficult than the revolution, because at that time, when the revolution happened, the whole world was sort of watching Egypt and cheering Egypt on. After President Sisi took over, it seemed a little bit gloomier for us because we didn't even know, there was still uncertainty from the West whether this was going to be a regime they support. So that was a very challenging time for us. And then, obviously, the devaluation of the Egyptian pound, which started a few years ago, but this year has gone down incredibly. So it's, to survive as a small business doing business in Egypt, you have to constantly be able to pivot. You constantly have to have not much of an ego, because in the last 20 years of doing business, so many times I felt like we're back to being a startup, you know, making money, seeing it all go, making money, seeing it all go, now seeing it being devalued by half just because of, you know, an overnight change in the currency. So it's a constant challenge. And of course, being a woman in the Middle East doing business comes with its own set of challenges, but I don't know, that's a whole nother story and a whole nother panel, which I'm sure women in any developing country can relate to. But things are getting better. I think our main issue is, unlike, because I travel a lot, I do business abroad a lot. Abroad, there's so many government initiatives and sort of women's business networks and ways to support women. I feel that we lack that a lot. Any support that I've had in my career from an NGO has probably been from an European NGO. We don't feel that there's enough resources and networks that support us or that want to see us succeed. You know, whether our government means it or not, the bureaucracy and red tape of doing business in Egypt is very challenging. It puts a lot of people off. There's also a fear of going bankrupt in Egypt because that's punishable by jail. So there's a fear of being an entrepreneur. And also, there's a very opaque taxation situation. So you could be, the tax rules change all the time. So you're constantly just kind of navigating a challenging environment. But if you succeed all that and you make your name, then things eventually get easier.
So you need a lot of adaptability and resilience,
Yes.
I understand from what you're trying to say. I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet about the women's empowerment. We'll come back to that when we get to the second half of our session. And hopefully we'll be looking at the way that multilateral collaboration can help assist some of these issues. But now I would like to go to Mario, who is going to help make the transition from the first half to the second half. You've written and sent a very interesting article to me, which will help us cover this topic of a paradigm shift, and also perhaps some surprises that have come up over the past few years, not only in North-South relations and South-South relations, in the way that the world is starting to perceive one another and their roles. So please, Mario.
Yes, Sari, and also George. I don't think that the idea of a paradigm shift represents the present situation. Why? The idea from Thomas Kuhn was, at a certain point, you have a certain view in science, in this case was mechanic physics, and then you move to quantum physics. Everything changes in the way in which you conceive the things. I think that the situation in which we are at present is better represented by the idea of an Italian that was called Antonio Gramsci, of interregne. What I mean with that? Gramsci, that was died during the fascism in prison, was saying, there are moments in history in which the old is identified as old, but is still there, and the new has not already arrived. And in this phase, monsters can appear. I think this situation, this type of definition represents better our situation, because we have a need of a new paradigm, but it's not there. And let me try to apply this idea on what is happening in the relationship between the North and the South, in fact. I was here this morning in several conferences and several panels, and often I listen to a kind of leitmotiv. Europe discussing about the war and saying Europe has not been assertive enough. We have to recognize that we are a power, that our value, our civilization is the best that could exist. Just to use the word of a representative of Europe at a certain point in an occasion, he said, Europe is a garden, outside there is the jungle. Well, this is obviously not to be taken literally, but it represents a certain view in which one actor pretends that needs to have more power, and in order to do so, to affirm its own self. This exercise resembled to me a little bit to a tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy, which is the King Lear. He was so fascinated by his power and the desire to get even more that he will end lonely. Now, why I think that this type of reasoning is limited? Because a lot of things are happening outside in what's supposed to be jungle. Of course, we have listened here now. Our friends are more legitimated than I am to speak about what is happening there. But we can add also other examples. Many extraordinary things are happening. The most important case of economic development in the history of human beings is what has happened recently to China. China, in 1850, was the first economy in the world. In beginning of 1970, was between the 5 poorest countries in the world. And today is back. India is not just China, India, Brazil, South Africa, many other countries. At present, the area in the world in which the economic growth is the highest is obviously Asia, followed by Africa. Latin America is lagging behind, but for sure, the place where there is no growth is the West. So for all these reasons, we pretend to affirm ourselves, something is happening outside, and we may risk not to be capable to understand what is happening to the other. In a certain sense, and I will close here, it occurs to me a joke, where there are two economists. I am an economist, nobody is perfect. So where there are two economists, and one economist every 2 minutes applaud in Paris. And the other says, what are you doing? I'm applauding. Why? Because I want to keep the crocodile away. Said, but we are in Paris. There is the sun. There are no crocodiles. So it does work. Exactly. That's a little bit the risk. The reason why I think we have this type of problem in the lenses, I can address in the second part of the question.
Okay. Well, we're going right now into the second part, and we only have probably a few minutes for each speaker. If I can, just drawing on what you were saying, Mario, something that you pointed out, which I think is indicative that there is a change, and that perhaps the West and the more developed countries are not even aware of the depth and breadth of the changes that are going on in the world, was the reaction of, again, putting everyone into one basket, but it's not very, very accurate, the global South to the war in Ukraine, and the position of many developing countries on whether or not they were in support of the West, or whether they were going to take the side of Russia, China, or just be silent. So I think, to your point, that there are many changes happening, and it's very important that the North and the South come together and they discuss these things in an open way is going to be key for us getting through the next phase of crisis. So, Mario, you're free to build on this. Everyone just has around 2 minutes, I think, for their next comment on this portion. So, how do you see, through multilateralism, can we start overcoming some of these key challenges? And of course, if you have any pearls of wisdom and a way to end on a positive note.
Do you want me to start?
Please, please.
Yes, yes. Let me summarize what you said so brilliantly with one example. We are always thinking, and you're right, about Ukraine. But something happened before the war of Ukraine, the 17th of February last year in Brussels, where after 3 years of suspension because of the COVID, took place the Africa Union, European Union Summit. What is interesting in the summit, many things, but one in particular, were the conclusion. At the conclusion, the Europeans came and they said, we would like to write in the final declaration a new alliance between Europe and Africa. And the Europeans were thinking that the fact to open the door would have created immediately a big passion and will to join the club. The president of the African Union answered, no thanks. We don't want to have a renewed alliance with Europe. We want a partnership, but a partnership that must be inclusive and non-exclusive. It tells a lot, this misunderstanding. You have expectation in one side, and on the other hand, and somebody asserting, no, things are not going as you are thinking. Let me give you two explanations about why there was this position. We did not realize that there is not only one way of development, and we will continue to think that there is only one way, that is the one that the West undertaken in the past. And obviously, as we have done it, we know how to do it, and we can teach the developing country what are the standards that are required. But in many occasions, the standards that are required are standards that we have applied now, not at the beginning of our process of development, and therefore they don't fit that much. You have plenty of countries that have followed different paths. China is an example, India is an example, many others I could make, and they didn't follow the orthodox recommendation of the West. There are countries that did follow and now are in kind of difficult situation. In between, you have many other cases. So this pretension that we know how to do it, things, doesn't apply. And in the world now, there are other economies that dialogue with the country of the South, and here comes the President of the African Union, a partnership inclusive and non-exclusive. It's not because I deal with you that I cannot deal with other countries as well. The second example is this idea that now with the war, we need a kind of coalition of democracies. And as soon as you call for democracy, everybody will come. But in reality, in the two fields, supposed to be democratic and authoritarian, we see a lot of differences. There are many countries in the supposed to be democratic side that have reduced a little bit the attachment to democratic value. The fact that the United States were guaranteeing the field is now challenged by internal problem of the United States that we all know. Right. So even this idea is not necessarily so convincing. If this is the case, I think, and here I conclude with what you requested, we should reinvent multilateralism because we need a table to discuss between countries that are different. The problem is that the present multilateralism, where I have been spending the majority of my life working, is built for the developed countries. There are very few developing countries at the table that matters for decision making. So the suggestion I will make is let's identify some file, and on those files, invent a process where you have tables that are more representative. Not necessarily everybody is at the table, but Africa needs to be there, Latin America needs to be there, Asia needs to be there, the West needs to be there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mario. Yasmine, if we could go back to the point that you mentioned before about women entrepreneurship, their role. This is closely connected to the work you've been doing over the years, the mission that you have. Do you see a way through enhanced collaboration, either South-South or North-South, that some of the challenges that you faced in your own career could be overcome?
Yes, I think what the West does brilliantly, and I'm sure it's still an issue for women abroad, but they are the messaging about highlighting the importance of women in the workforce and the equality of women in relationships and family, and in terms of even, the governmental family policies abroad. Kind of everything in society reflects that equality, or at least striving towards that equality. So I think that trickles down. I think what would be great is, obviously a country like ours depends so much on foreign aid and foreign investment and foreign collaborations. If with all this contribution that they make into the country's infrastructure and day-to-day needs, that there could also be more collaboration on the fact of empowering women, empowering the young generation. We have a huge 60% of Egypt is under age 30 or 25. It's a very young country. And because of social media and the way of technology works, they all know how everybody is living around the world now. So they have so many unmet hopes and dreams and pursuits that, it's a great thing if it's channeled in the right way, but it's a dangerous thing if they have no outlet and no opportunities for all their energy, So I think if the West kind of would think, I know Egypt is a very strategic country, and our government plays a strategic role now in the region for security and stability, but in the end, the real stability of Egypt will come when the entire country feels that they have opportunities, they have a future to look forward to, women and men. There's a lot of men also that are not getting the opportunities they receive in the country. So yes, we have our own challenges as women and stereotypes and society pressures that we have to deal with, but there are also a lot of young men not even able to start their careers because of lack of opportunity. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge we face.
Yeah, we mentioned this in our discussions before about the way that most aid is targeted for the most vulnerable. And meanwhile, you have the other portion of society, which is they might be highly educated, they have financial flexibility. When things get difficult, they're able to move. So from what you mentioned before, the middle class of Egypt seems to be left behind. And unfortunately, we won't be able to go into that anymore. We'll go now to Bogolo. We talked a lot about Africa. Mario mentioned Africa as well, multilateralism. That's something that you also mentioned in your opening discussion. So I wonder if you'd like to pick up on this, and of course, anything else from your perspective that you can see.
No, certainly. I think Mario brought up a very interesting point. And one of the way that geopolitics is changing at the moment, and I could spend hours on this particular conversation. And I think one thing that I want to highlight at the moment is, can Europe see what is happening with BRICS? And that for the first time in the longest time, actually for the first time in history, the Chinese currency is among top traded in the developing countries, and has surpassed the dollar, has surpassed the euro. That, to me, means we should all be taking notice. Many of our energy contracts now in the continent are moving away from using the US dollar. There is certainly a shift that is happening, and it's because of what I outlined when I started the conversation. But one other thing that I just want to mention as I gravitate towards a positive, yes. What can we do, is that we know for sure that the continent is going to be quite influential in the future, and 85% of the new 4 billion people by 2100 are going to be African. And this is a fact. We know that there's a demographic dividend that's going to benefit the continent that Europe won't have, that the US won't have. And so the way that we structure our relations right now will be quite critical in the way that we share skills, resources, and are able to influence what geopolitics look like. So it's very critical that we have first the multilateral system being very responsive to the current issues and to be reformed to respond to current issues. As Mario rightfully said, the multilateral system as it stands now, if we're taking the IFIs, MDBs, they were responding to the war in Europe, and now are not sufficient to respond to issues of developing countries, are not sufficient to respond to issues now of the ensuing polycrisis. So a reform needs to happen in order for us to reduce all the biases that exist in the multilateral space. And we also, if we bring it a little closer to the EU-Africa relations, this year in particular, as was 3 years ago, there's a fiscal crunch for a lot of African countries. And we called back then, President Macky Sall actually, called for a very strong SDR recycling program by European countries. And a few rose to the challenge. President Macron spoke quite strongly about this, but we need to see more happening in this space. I know there's no more time, but one is SDR recycling in order for us to finance budgets for development in the continent. And two, we need to urgently create a very strong working group that will revise the common debt framework and restate the DSSI. And then three, we need to really work on a very credible, transparent, and just transition agenda and finance that just transition so that we do not work on the same industrial development pathway that focuses on brown industries, and this touches on carbon policy that I could spend time on. And then lastly, I think we also just need to be more strategic about exactly how we're going to deal with pandemics and real crises as they rise, and we need to deal with real sector issues and make sure that investment and not aid is a priority for the partnership. And I know that the Global Gateway was started by the EU as a response to the China FOCAC budget, but we need to stop working on a competitive basis and think more strategically about how those partnerships are actually mutually beneficial.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you get the last comment, please. Daban, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The last comment is it can be very challenging for us, for Iraq, especially when we talk about the cooperation between the developed countries in Europe and Iraq. Iraq is the second largest oil producer in OPEC and the 60th largest in the world, and it can be a very cooperative partner of the European countries since we are speaking, since our country is one of the strong players, global players of energy sector. If we benefit from the experience of the developed countries, the developed European countries, Iraq can be a stable country. Then the European companies, the European investors can come to Iraq and invest in Iraqi market, because Iraqi market is one of the biggest markets in the Middle East. Annually, we import up to $60 billion worth commodities from the other countries, because the industrial sector of the country lacks almost everything. So it can be a good chance for the European countries to send their companies and first to start the partnership with Iraq in order to support the government to continue these reforms, make a stable country. Then it will be a good field for the European countries to send their companies, their investors to invest in Iraq. And this partnership can go, like Iraq can be a new supporter of energy sector in European countries. Now you are facing some problems right now, because the region that I live in, the city that I live in Soleimani, we own 3.5% of world's reserve of natural gas, and Iraq has a big reserve of natural gas, but because we don't have the experience of the developed countries, we cannot benefit from this sector. So we hope that the European countries can be much more cooperative with Iraq, so that we can benefit from this cooperation.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
We are unfortunately out of time. Hopefully next year there'll be more panels, the perspective of the developing world.